Hello and welcome back to the Little Craft House. If we haven't met before, my name is Nicole and I like making polymer clay earrings. These ones here are some of my favourite that I made a little while back, my little Friday ones. They're made using polymer clay, resin, and I used my Cricut Maker to do the decals. If you'd like to see how I made these, I shall pop a link in the description box to the tutorial where I made these ones. But today we are doing something different. Today we are going to be using some silicone molds. So these silicone molds are lots of fun to use, a great way to use up little scrappy bits of clay that you may have lying around as well, because they don't take a lot of clay to use. And yeah, we're going to make a little slab work that could be used to cut out a bunch of earrings for a collection. So occasionally when I make slabs, I like to do them just as prototypes so that I have them for future reference to be able to recreate at a later stage if it's something that I like the pattern of and I like the design. So that's how I'm going to end this tutorial today, is actually making this as a prototype and not cutting earrings out of it. However, if you were following along at home and going to recreate this for yourself, of course you could cut some earrings. So this is the piece that I end up with at the end, which is just beautiful. I love it. There's a few things I would probably do differently next time. What I will do is write those notes on the back later as well, just so that I've got it for reference next time I go to make it. But yeah, so I'm going to work through making this a little slab today with you guys so that you can see how I made it. So over the years, I've come to have quite a collection of silicone molds. These can be used for lots of different things, but we are going to be using the polymer clay in them today. You can of course use liquid clay and things like that, but my favorite way is just putting the polymer clay straight in. This mold here is one of my favorite. It's a bit bendy. It's one I made myself. The other ones have all come from in our store. Over time we've sold different designs and we've just released some recently if you do want to go and check them out. So I never actually realised before that I seem to have a thing for floral ones, quite a floral collection, which is where today's little design is going to be inspired from. So I went and gathered up a bunch of polymer clay that I've got sitting around on my bench as well. As I mentioned before, it doesn't really take a lot of polymer clay to use in these molds as they're quite shallow. They don't take a lot. So I went and grabbed a bunch of sort of spring colours to make this design today. So some of these will be straight out the pack and some have probably just been mixed combinations that have come from scrappy mixes along the way. So as with any clay design that we do need to get our polymer clay soft and workable and what is called conditioned. So just using my little acrylic roller here, just giving a few quick rolls and folds, just until it softens up a little bit, making it easier to use. So when it comes to using our polymer clay with the silicone molds, I do find that the softer you can make your clay, the easier it is to use and the easier it is for us to be able to squish down and get into all the details that are within the molds. I usually use Sculpey Primo and Sculpey Souffle in my designs. I find Sculpey Primo slightly easier to use in the molds, and I think it's because it's a little bit shinier, a little bit stickier, and it's not as, it's got the different texture to the souffle. So the souffle brand is a little bit more of a matte finish and has that little bit more of a suede-like grittier texture. And sometimes that I find it can be a little bit harder to get it to stay within the mold. I find the Primo to be a little bit easier. Okay, so I thought we would start by creating some strawberries. This is one of my new molds, so I'm dying to get to use it. I'm also going to be using this rounded ball tip tool here. I think it's a Sculpey branded one. I've had this one for quite a while and I like the way that it helps me to squish the clay into the molds. And I'm going to start by cutting the clay that I'm going to use into some smaller pieces. So I find it easier to apply in smaller pieces into the molds rather than just going with a big chunk. I find that it's easier to squish it down and get that detail. With these strawberries, they're also dual colour, so obviously the green on the top and the red for the strawberry. So I've got to play around a little bit and make sure that the greenery finishes where I want it to, and it doesn't go down into the strawberry bit too much, or the red doesn't come up into that leafy part as well. So yeah, as I'm squishing it in here, I'm just using that ball tool, rocking it backwards and forwards and giving it a good squish to stay in those sections. And it doesn't matter if the clay is sticking out the top, above the mould, if it's not perfectly in. We're just going to mush it down as much as we can, and we're going to trim it in just a minute. So I'm just going to get all the clay in first. So I think these moulds were originally designed for fondant for cake making, and they can also be used for waxing, candle making as well. And one of the things that I like about them is there is a lot of detail to them. So everything that I'm putting into the clay that I'm putting into the moulds is going to pick up on every single little bit of detail that the mould has. So with the strawberries, it's got all little indents for where the seeds are, and the leaves have those little lines like leaves have, like little veins as well. So it's going to pick up every little detail that it has. So I'm just making sure that I'm squashing the clay in so that it's packed in nice and firmly, so there's no air bubbles, and you're not going to see any of those join lines of those little pieces that I put in either, because I'm literally mushing it all together to become one. So one thing with the silicone molds is that it's definitely not a quick process. It does take quite a while, especially if you've got the more detailed molds, the more detailed shapes, and you're using multiple colours. It does take a little while to use, and they don't always work out perfectly the first time until you get used to the portions of clay that you're putting in them. But as always, polymer clay is really versatile, really flexible, so we can just pop them out, and if we don't like it, we can just chop it back up and reuse those pieces. So there's no wastage. It doesn't matter if they don't work out perfectly the first time. Right, so I'm happy with how this is now all pushed in, and I've grabbed my flexi blade. So the flexible blades work really well because you're able to move the blade on a bit of an angle so it's not straight, not super straight and super flat. And I've just carved off the top excess clay that's there. Sometimes you'll notice that you need to then fill up a few more bits if it created a bit of a drag or if there was a bit of an air bubble underneath. So you can just go back in and fill up any of those gaps that may have occurred, and then just use the blade again to scrape off any excess. Right, so that's looking pretty good. So now we're just going to pop it out. There we go. And you can see there all those little seedy details that I was talking about earlier. That little greenery on top. So yeah, that's super cute. Okay, next up we're going to work on some flowers. So as you can see here, my mould has multiple flowers on it, but I do like to just work with one at a time. I just find it much easier just doing one at a time and alternating around as I go. So I've just started by putting a little bit of clay for the center there, but as I'm squishing it in, I'm noticing that it's coming out of that center part too much. There's too much clay there, so I just need to reduce that down. So I'm just going to halve it, and we'll just squash that into position to start with so that he doesn't move. And then we can start adding the colour around that. So quite often I get asked about moulds and baking within the moulds. Personally, I like to just make my designs in the mould and pop them out whilst raw, because I quite often like to put them onto the base clay and make use them for slab work. So I don't like to bake within the molds. Some molds are bakeable. Any packaging that they come with should say if they are bakeable. If it doesn't say, then chances are they probably aren't bakeable, and probably best not to risk it. Personally, I like to just make all of my pieces first and then just bake them all afterwards anyway. So if I was going to be making these as studs, I would just make a bunch of them, pop them all out, put them onto a tray, and then bake them all together. Because if the design hasn't quite worked properly, if you pop it out whilst it's raw, you get the opportunity to change it and correct any mistakes you've made. Once it's baked, obviously you can't fix any of those little mistakes that may have been made. Right, so I've got another little top tip for you. So when using the silicone molds, it is easier if we make our clay nice and soft and squishy because it squishes down much easier. But that can also lead to a few problems when you're removing it from the mold. So if you find that as you're removing it from the mold, it's distorting because the clay is too soft and too sticky, you can always pop your mold into the fridge or freezer for 5 to 10 minutes. It will help to cool the clay down, firm it back up again, and then it makes it easier to remove from those molds. So you may have noticed that I have just adjusted the speed a little bit of my filming, and we go into a time lapse in a moment, just because it's quite a long process, but I still want you guys to be able to see how I've created these pieces. So I mentioned before that there will always be some little failures. Here's one here. That yellow center just smudged out way too much into the flower. So instead of cutting that one up and redoing it, I'm actually just going to pop him to the side because I will always have edges of my design that will need just little parts of flowers. So I might be able to cut some of those petals off and just use the petals to fill some gaps as well. So not going to be wasted. He'll be just popped to the side, and if I don't end up using him, then that's when I'll chop him back up and separate the two colours so that they can be used again for something different. And this little mould here has some little green leaves. If I didn't have a mould with leaves, I would just try and make some manually because you always need those little filler bits to put in around to fill gaps. Okay, so now we're up to creating the base for our design, and I'm going to use the Sculpey Soufflé Ivory. Ivory is one of my favourite colours to use as a base because it's not so harsh like white is. It's just a bit more of that warmer tone, and it just goes with all the colours nicely as well. So I'm just going to condition it up, so just giving it some rolls. I've just noticed my roller is dirty, so hopefully that doesn't transfer over onto the clay. I clearly didn't notice it at the time. Just giving it some rolls and folds, getting it conditioned, getting it soft, and then I will pop it through the pasta maker just to continue to condition it. I've realised I don't have enough here. I just want to create a small design today, but I did need a little bit extra clay as well. So yeah, I like to use my pasta maker to create the flat levelness. I've got some level guides, but the pasta machine is quite easy to use. I set it on the thickest setting so that it comes out to being about a 3mm in thickness usually, but today, because we're going to layer it and make it three-dimensional, we're going to go slightly thinner, so probably about a 2mm thickness. I think that's like the third setting on my machine, and I'm just going to trim off these edges as well, just so that it's nice and square. Now, if you were doing this design to cut your shapes out, obviously you don't have to cut off those little edges. You can just leave them on and just work around them. But as I'm going to be doing this one as a prototype, I just want it to be all nice and neat. And I'm also applying some little bits of gold leaf foil here. So just to give the background just a little bit of shine, just to make it a little bit extra and just give it something a little bit fancier as well. So I do like to use some leaf foil for that. I mentioned at the beginning that there was a few things that I would change about this design, and one of those things is this leaf foil. I do like the look of it, however I needed to add more. So once I ended up putting my pieces, all my flowers and floral design on these, the gold wasn't noticeable in a lot of sections. So if I was to do it again, I would make sure that there was definitely larger sections of gold. So I may possibly tear off larger sections rather than just being those little bitty bits on there. Alternatively, I just need to add a lot more so that there is not quite as big a gaps with as much ivory showing. Now, I don't think I show it at the end, but there is one particular corner where the gold is nicely visible between the flowers. So that corner is what I would be aiming for in future. So yeah, definitely needs a lot more on it than what I've put. But yes, I'm going to add that to the notes on the back of my prototype so that I know for next time. And so now I'm just going to organize all my little flowers because I've kind of got them all over the desk. I'm going to pop them all down so I can see what they are. We're going to place them all on randomly, but I want them to be nice and close together. So yeah, I'm just going to put them down so I can see. I think I've spoken about this before in my other videos, but I'll mention it again here. So when we're adding raw clay to raw clay, we don't need any adhesives to hold it together. As long as we push it down just a little bit so that a bond is created between the two raw clays. So we just add a little bit of pressure, it'll stick nicely and we won't need to add any adhesives to it. If you did want to add something like liquid clay, you could just get a paintbrush and paint on a layer of the liquid clay to start with before adding the flowers on, and that would give that additional hold. I do find as well when you do cut your shapes out, the pressure from the cutters going through also helps to bond your pieces on. So that additional is not necessary in my opinion, but yeah, up to you guys when you're creating your own. And so at this stage, I'm just going to lightly put my pieces on to create the design. That way I can move them around if I need to. I don't want any colours being the same next to each other or anything. So yeah, I'm just going to gently put them on so that they're able to be moved if they need to be. I do quite enjoy this process here where it's a bit like a puzzle, trying to slot each of these flowers and leaves in without leaving too much of a gap. Right, so as you can see there, I've got my little dodgy flower, the one where the centre kind of exploded out of it. So now I'm just going to try and find a space where I can fit him in so that he's not wasted, because half of him is actually okay. So I think this is going to be his little position here. So if I chop it in half, you can barely even notice that he had that little explosion happen. And then I've still got the other part there, which I can use some of those petals for as well. And something that I really like about each of these molds as well, I kind of touched on before, that each of these flowers are a really good size that you could make them either a stud, or you could also use them as a topper to your earring as well. So if I was to cut out some earring components from this slab, say like some circles or some teardrops or something, I could use just a flower made in the mold as the topper, so then I could have a little interesting topper that matched without being part of this slab as well. So I could just concentrate on cutting components from this and not the actual like stud component parts as well. And even though I'm just going to bake this sheet up as is and just have this as my prototype, I will definitely be doing this again because I really like how this has worked out. I really like this three-dimensional image that it's created. I'm loving the colours. I like how full it is. And I think with some additional bits of that gold leaf underneath, it would look really nice. So I am definitely going to be recreating this one in the future. So make sure you keep your eye out in Reels, because when I do, I'll probably pop it up on there and that will show the finished pieces that I'll cut from it as well. But so even though I'm not cutting pieces today, I thought I would just grab a couple of my cutters just to show how those pieces would look if I was to cut from this slab. So yeah, definitely nice and full, lots of colour. You get to see lots of those images as well. It's not too many partial flowers within it. It looks really good. So yes, this is definitely something that I will be recreating. And if you guys have some flower molds at home, or see some that you're able to get your hands on, I definitely recommend, because it's a great way of creating a really unique piece or pieces for a collection. Okay, so that pretty much brings me to the end of today's little tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed coming along with me using these molds and creating something really unique and really pretty. So if you have enjoyed today and would like to see more tutorials like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and also the like button on today's post, which will help push out my videos and have more people be able to see and discover them as well. That would definitely be appreciated. So thank you once again for joining me, and I hope that I'll see you again soon. I'll be back next week with another tutorial, so maybe I'll see you then. Enjoy the rest of your week and I will see you next week. Bye!